hunger, poverty, conflicts, internal wars. To the eyes of the world, Africa seems like a forgotten continent. So much pain, so much suffering. Could all of this be the result of a curse? To understand where this idea of a curse on Africa comes from, we need to go back to the story of Noah and his sons. Noah had 3 sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. After the flood in a famous episode, Noah was drunk and naked in his tent. It was Ham, his son, who saw this, and instead of covering his father, told his brothers. This caused Noah's indignation, and when he woke up he cursed not Ham, but Ham's son Canaan, Noah's grandson. This passage has been interpreted in many ways over the centuries. What started as a family story turned into a theological justification for supporting racism. Some people started saying that Noah's curse extended to Ham's descendants, who were believed to be African peoples. This paved the way for centuries of oppression, slavery, and injustice, all based on a distorted interpretation. The truth is, the curse was specifically on Canaan, Noah's grandson, and says nothing about Africa or African peoples. This wrong interpretation was widely used to justify a system of domination and exploitation, something that has no biblical basis. These completely wrong interpretations shaped a distorted view of what the Bible actually says. And these ideas not only spread, but were used to maintain a system of power. The truth is, when a group controls what people believe, they have control. That's exactly what happened. During colonization, especially in Europe and the Western world, the idea that certain people were cursed by God was convenient to justify exploitation. They needed an excuse to do what they were doing, and unfortunately the Bible was misused to justify it. The slavery and exploitation of African peoples and other indigenous groups were sustained by the logic that these people were destined to suffer. But here's an important point: interpretation. You see, what happened was a manipulation of Scripture. The Bible was taken out of context, maliciously used to justify actions that go against everything God teaches. And because this became the official truth for centuries, who dared to question it? Who had the power to say this was wrong? Now, bringing this to today, it's interesting to think about how these ideas still linger. Even now, many people don't question these things, just accepting them as truths passed down through generations. It's as if this cursed narrative has deeply rooted itself in many people's minds. But let's think about it together. Does this really make sense? If we follow the logic, if we stop and think critically, we'll realize that this supposed curse has no foundation. What really happened was that faith was co-opted to justify a model of exploitation and domination. And this is where the video challenges these misconceptions. We need to teach, educate, clarify. And that's not easy because, like any idea that's been spread for a long time, it's hard to uproot. But when you start to dismantle this narrative, you begin to realize that the idea of God cursing African peoples was never in the Bible. It was a socio-cultural construction, not a theological one. If you think about it, society has always looked for ways to divide people, us versus them. And unfortunately, this division even found its way into biblical interpretations. But if you really look, you'll see that God's message is the exact opposite of that. The Bible speaks of unity, of reconciliation. Christ's message is clear: love your neighbor without distinction. But in practice, this message was suffocated by those who wanted to use religion as a tool for control. And so, we see how these fabricated curses and theological distortions ended up creating a world where injustice was seen as something divine, where the suffering of a people was seen as something deserved, predestined. Now, what I want to make clear to you is this: when we look at these wrong interpretations with a critical eye, we begin to understand that all of this was constructed by people, by interests, not by God. The true biblical message has nothing to do with this. If there's one thing the Bible teaches, it's that all men were created in the image of God, and that love and justice should guide our actions. And look, this isn't just a religious issue. From a sociological perspective, it becomes even clearer. Oppression always needs a justification, and for centuries, the preferred justification was religious. But this manipulation is so perverse that it completely distorts faith itself. People use the Bible as if it were a manual for discrimination, not love. And this distortion ended up shaping how society dealt with Africa, for example. From a philosophical point of view, this is also interesting. Great thinkers like Foucault talked about how power shapes truth. What people believe to be true is often nothing more than a social construction. And when you mix political, economic, and religious power, you create a truth that seems unquestionable. That's exactly what happened. So when we talk about God cursing Africa, we're dealing with something that was invented, created to sustain a system of power. And the big lesson here is that we can't accept these things without questioning them. The Bible, when read with an open heart and a sincere eye, shows us that God would never curse an entire people. At least, I believe that. The idea of a cursed Africa is a construct that definitely needs to be undone. But this doesn't happen overnight. Like any idea spread for centuries, it's deeply rooted, and it's up to us now to question and teach, to show that true faith, God's true message, is about love and justice. These curses and distortions have no place in what God truly teaches. The challenge is great, but it's necessary. And that's why I'm putting myself out here, challenging these misconceptions, showing that the biblical truth is much greater and more beautiful than what's been distorted over time. It's time to open our eyes to the reality that all of us, regardless of where we come from, are loved by God. And that's the big message I want to share. God bless you and your family.